a teacher filled with bias and racism, a tense classroom, and a twist that no one expected, ready to expose years of hidden prejudice. Get ready for a story that will make you rethink what really happens behind classroom doors. Maplewood High School was a prestigious institution, always proud of its academic achievements and talented teachers. It was a modern school with advanced facilities, but hidden beneath the surface were biases and discrimination not easily visible to everyone. As a new student, Daniel White walked into Maplewood. He would undoubtedly sense this tension, especially since he quickly became the center of attention. That morning, autumn sunlight filtered through the large classroom windows, casting its light on the neatly arranged desks. The school bell rang steadily, signaling the start of class. Students hurriedly lined up and sat down, but the atmosphere in the classroom felt more tense than usual. At Maplewood, Ms. Emily Carson was a teacher known for her strictness. She not only demanded high academic standards, but also treated students differently, with many noticing that she seemed to dislike black students. Ms. Carson, with her neatly trimmed short hair and professional business attire, stood on the podium, her cold eyes sweeping across the faces of the students. Her gaze was sharp, as if searching for the slightest mistakes to correct right from the start. The students in the class were used to that look. Some even felt nervous whenever her eyes lingered on them too long. Just as all the students were seated, the classroom door creaked open. Standing at the entrance was a new student, Daniel White. He was tall, with short, neatly cut hair, and carrying a messenger bag over his shoulder. Daniel stepped into the room with a determined but slightly tense look. His eyes quickly scanned the rows of desks, where other students were staring at him. Some were curious, some were judging, and some were indifferent. Daniel's arrival wasn't met with warm welcomes, but rather a tense, silent acknowledgement. Miss Carson raised her eyebrow slightly as she saw Daniel, clearly showing her displeasure. She didn't know anything about this new student, but just one glance and she had already decided that he would be a problem in her class. Her voice rang out clear and articulate, but cold and mocking. "Ah, welcome, Daniel White. It seems we have a new member in the class." Her smile was forced and insincere, making it clear to everyone that this was just a formal welcome. "I hope you can keep up with our curriculum," Ms. Carson continued, her eyes never leaving Daniel. "My class has very high standards, and we don't tolerate any slacking off." The words high standards were emphasized clearly, a reminder to Daniel that she didn't believe he could meet her expectations. Sensing the unwelcoming tone, Daniel quietly walked to an empty desk at the back of the room. He placed his bag down and sat, trying not to let her words get to him. He knew that from the moment he stepped into this class, he wasn't being judged for his academic abilities or personality, but simply because he was the new black student. He had faced moments like this at his previous school, and now it was happening again. As Daniel settled into his seat, a few students exchanged glances. Some were surprised, unsure if this new kid would cause trouble. Others, especially those familiar with Ms. Carson's biased ways, smirked slightly, waiting to see how the new student would handle it. The atmosphere in the classroom became heavier, and everyone could feel it. Ms. Carson stood still for a long time, watching Daniel as if weighing whether he could become a threat to her authority in the classroom. Finally, she turned back to the board and began her lesson, but in her mind, she had already formed a clear bias against the new student. Daniel wasn't just new, he was someone Ms. Carson didn't want in her class. The school day had begun, but for Daniel, this wasn't going to be an ordinary morning. He could feel that a series of challenges lay ahead. He knew that from now on, he would have to face unseen yet powerful biases from the teacher and possibly even some of the students. But Daniel was determined not to let that bring him down. He would have to prove that he belonged here, regardless of the doubts and biases of those around him. Once the class was settled, Ms. Emily Carson began her lesson on one of her favorite history topics, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. With a large portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. hanging in the corner, this subject wasn't just part of the curriculum, but carried deep lessons about justice and equality. However, with her deeply ingrained prejudices hidden under the guise of a model teacher, Ms. Carson's approach to the topic was laced with subtle biases that few could recognize. Today we'll discuss the civil rights movement for African Americans, she said, her tone serious but slightly distant. This was a critical time in history, but we must understand it correctly and not let modern opinions or personal views distort the facts. She emphasized personal views, her gaze gliding over Daniel, who sat quietly at the back of the class. Just as she finished speaking, Daniel raised his hand. He had read extensively about the movement and was confident in his knowledge. This was a topic close to him, not only because of his heritage, but also because Daniel had always been concerned with social injustices and the role of African Americans in driving change. He thought this was an opportunity to participate and share his thoughts. But Ms. Carson ignored his raised hand. She turned towards the students at the front, choosing a boy sitting in the front row to speak, even though he seemed less interested in the topic. "Hannah, can you tell the class what the key elements of this movement were?" Ms. Carson asked, pretending not to see Daniel. Hannah, the blonde girl in the front row, mumbled a few general statements, clearly unprepared. Daniel lowered his hand, knowing full well what was happening. Ms. Carson was deliberately ignoring him. Even though he realized it, he didn't give up. The lesson continued, and each time Ms. Carson asked a question, Daniel persistently raised his hand, only to be ignored repeatedly. The other students in the class began to notice. Some felt uncomfortable, recognizing that Daniel was being treated unfairly, while others sat quietly, observing with curious expressions. The atmosphere in the classroom grew increasingly tense. Everyone could feel the silent standoff between Ms. Carson and Daniel, even though nothing was explicitly said. Finally, when she could no longer avoid it, Ms. Carson sighed loudly and reluctantly turned to Daniel. "Fine, Daniel. What do you have to say?" she asked, her voice cold and filled with irritation. Daniel kept calm even though he felt insulted. "I think the civil rights movement wasn't just about fighting for the rights of black people, but also a reminder of how systemic racism affected American society. It's an issue that impacted everyone, not just black people." Before Daniel could finish his statement, Ms. Carson interrupted with a thin smile on her face. "Systemic racism? Daniel, are you sure you're understanding that historical period correctly? This isn't a modern political discussion. We're talking about history, and I suggest you focus on the recorded facts rather than bringing in modern concepts." The tension in the class skyrocketed. Some students sat silently, exchanging uneasy glances, while a few in the back chuckled, clearly entertained by Daniel's struggle against Ms. Carson's veiled ridicule. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. He knew Ms. Carson was trying to put him in an uncomfortable situation, but he decided not to overreact. Instead, he calmly replied, "I believe that the racial injustices we saw during the civil rights movement are still important to understanding society today." Once again, Ms. Carson cut him off, waving her hand dismissively as if to end the conversation. "That's enough, Daniel. I think you need to focus more on the lesson rather than bringing your personal feelings into this. Remember, we're learning history, not modern-day politics." The class fell into silence after Ms. Carson's words. Daniel sat up straight, gripping his notebook tightly, trying to control his anger. He felt not only shut down by the teacher, but also publicly humiliated in front of the whole class. But he decided not to react too strongly, knowing that it would only make things worse. The lesson continued with an increasingly tense atmosphere, but the silent clash between Ms. Carson and Daniel had become more apparent than ever. Ms. Carson carried on with her lesson without paying attention to Daniel, but he knew that from now on, he would face more challenges in this class. Her bias was no longer vague. It had become a clear, silent battle. Daniel understood that he would need to be stronger to confront the difficulties that lay ahead. After the simmering confrontation during the lesson on the civil rights movement, the tension in the classroom seemed to grow heavier each time Ms. Carson glanced at Daniel. Though Daniel tried to stay calm and ignore the judgmental stares, he knew he had become the target of negative attention from his teacher. The discrimination was no longer just a matter of being ignored, It had become more open and direct. And Daniel could feel that Ms. Carson had no intention of stopping. The next day, when Daniel entered the classroom, he mentally prepared himself for another difficult lesson. He had grown used to Ms. Carson deliberately skipping over him during discussions, but what he didn't expect was for her to take her attack to a new level, more direct and more public. As soon as Daniel sat down, Ms. Carson turned from the blackboard, her cold eyes locking onto him. "Daniel, are you chewing gum?" she asked, her tone sharp, cutting through the silence in the classroom. All eyes turned toward Daniel. Daniel paused, shocked. He wasn't chewing gum. He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, Ms. Carson continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've told this class many times. This is a place for learning, not a playground. Spit it out immediately." Every eye in the room was now focused on Daniel, waiting for his response. Some students lowered their heads, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, while others, amused by the drama unfolding, smirked. Daniel could feel the mockery and injustice coming from all sides, but he kept calm. Instead of arguing, he stood up, walked to the trash can in the corner, and mimed spitting out a piece of gum that didn't exist. The room fell silent. No one said a word, but confusion was written all over many students' faces. When Daniel returned to his seat, he caught the smirks of some students who were enjoying his humiliation. Others, like Sarah, the girl in the front row, shook their heads in quiet frustration, feeling the injustice but lacking the courage to speak up. Daniel sat down, gripping his pen tightly, trying to hold his composure, even though he felt deeply insulted. The lesson continued, but Ms. Carson didn't let up on Daniel. She constantly criticized him for the smallest things. He sat up straight, taking notes diligently, but whenever Ms. Carson walked by, she found something to criticize. "Daniel, is that the proper way to sit? This is a classroom, not your living room," she barked, ignoring the fact that Daniel's posture was no different from any other student's. The tension in the room continued to build. Some students, like Sarah and a few others, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable witnessing the unnecessary bullying Daniel was enduring. However, no one was brave enough to say anything, fearing that they too would become targets. Still, the growing empathy for Daniel was evident in the concerned looks he was receiving from more and more students. The breaking point came during a group discussion. The class was divided into small groups to discuss the day's reading, and Daniel raised his hand to contribute. He had thought carefully and prepared a strong argument to share with his group. But just as he began to speak, Ms. Carson, who had been watching from afar, quickly approached. Her lips curled into a cold smile, and her voice cut through the silence of the classroom. "Daniel, I'm sorry, but could you speak more clearly? Not everyone is used to your accent." Ms. Carson's words hit Daniel like a punch. The comment wasn't just a personal insult. It was an overt display of racism. A wave of shock and discomfort spread through the class. Some students sat with their mouths agape, not believing what they had just heard. Sarah, sitting in the front, turned around to look at Daniel with worried eyes, while a few students chuckled, treating it as entertainment. Daniel felt a surge of anger and helplessness. He had done everything to avoid causing trouble, always remaining calm and respectful. But now, Ms. Carson's racist comment was testing his patience. Yet again, he decided not to let his anger get the best of him. Daniel clenched his fists under the desk, his cold gaze meeting Ms. Carson's, but he said nothing. He knew that speaking up would only make things worse. The class ended in a heavy silence. When the bell rang, the students quietly filed out, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. Daniel packed up his books without a word, trying to ignore the mocking or sympathetic glances from his classmates. But he knew that his confrontation with Ms. Carson had only just begun, and he would need to brace himself for even greater challenges in the days to come. Ms. Carson, standing at the front of the room, watched Daniel's every move with a look of satisfaction. She thought she had silenced the new student, showing him who held the power in the classroom. But she didn't know that, inside Daniel, a new determination was building. He wouldn't let this discrimination break him. He would find a way to fight back, not just for himself, but for all students facing similar injustices. After the tense and oppressive class sessions with Ms. Carson, the atmosphere in the classroom became even more suffocating. The students had begun to notice the blatant bias Ms. Carson directed toward Daniel. Some felt uncomfortable and resentful, while others remained silent or secretly supported the teacher's unjust behavior. The tension continued to build, and everyone could sense that something major was about to happen. One morning, Ms. Carson announced an upcoming presentation to the class. The students were asked to prepare a presentation on the U.S. civil rights movement, a topic Daniel was well versed in. For Daniel, this was an opportunity to prove his abilities and break the prejudices that Ms. Carson had placed upon him. He spent days researching, gathering materials, and preparing thoroughly. He knew that Ms. Carson wouldn't easily acknowledge his efforts, but Daniel was determined to do his best. The day of the presentation arrived, and the atmosphere in the classroom was tense like a tightly wound spring. The students took turns presenting in front of the class, some confident, others nervous. When it was Daniel's turn, he walked up to the front with slightly shaky hands but a determined look. He had prepared well, and he was confident in what he was going to present. Before starting, Daniel quickly glanced at Ms. Carson, who sat at her desk like a predator waiting to pounce. She didn't say anything, just smiled coldly, clearly ready to tear into his presentation. Daniel began his presentation by introducing key figures in the civil rights movement, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Rosa Parks. He had meticulously prepared, using strong evidence and academic sources to support his points. He focused on the racial inequalities embedded in the American system during that time, and how the civil rights movement had worked to challenge that structure. From the moment he started, Ms. Carson made her disapproval clear. She sat with her arms crossed, her cold eyes watching his every move. Her pen tapped rhythmically against the desk, as if counting down the moments until she could strike. Despite this, Daniel continued his presentation calmly and professionally, with the sole aim of proving that he deserved to be heard in this classroom. Midway through his presentation, Daniel paused to answer a question about how the civil rights movement had impacted not just African Americans, but American society as a whole. Immediately, Ms. Carson's hand shot up. She stood slowly, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Daniel, I'm curious as to why you chose to focus so much on the racial aspect of your presentation. Aren't you overlooking other key elements of the movement? Don't you think you're only seeing a small part of the whole picture?" The class fell silent. A few students looked at each other, surprised at the thinly veiled jab in Ms. Carson's question. Daniel took a deep breath and calmly replied, "I believe the issue of racial injustice is central to understanding the civil rights movement. It's the main driver behind the protests and the struggle. Ignoring that would mean missing the entire point of the movement." Ms. Carson didn't let him finish. She cut him off, her tone harsher now. "That's your opinion, but I think you're confusing your personal feelings with historical facts. We're not here to discuss modern-day political issues or your personal grievances. This is a history class, and I expect you to focus on the academic side, not your subjective views." A wave of tension washed over the room. Daniel stood silently for a moment, feeling like all his efforts were being dismissed. He had anticipated that Ms. Carson would find a way to undermine his presentation, but he hadn't expected her to publicly reject his entire perspective, turning it into a personal attack. Daniel tried to remain composed, though he could feel the mocking stares from some students in the class. He had put so much effort into this presentation, and now, in front of everyone, Ms. Carson was tearing it apart. He took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "I don't believe my analysis is personal. I've supported every point with academic evidence." As soon as Daniel finished speaking, Ms. Carson stood up from her chair, her eyes cold as she prepared to shut down the conversation once and for all. "Daniel, perhaps you need to reassess your ability to analyze. Focusing too much on the racial aspect while neglecting other important parts of history shows that you don't fully understand this lesson. If you can't grasp the entire picture, maybe you're not fit for the expectations of this class." Her words rang out like thunder in the silent classroom. Everyone held their breath, not daring to speak. Daniel stood there, his eyes glistening with emotion but filled with resolve. He knew Ms. Carson was trying to humiliate him in front of the class, but he refused to let her defeat him. Daniel's presentation ended in heavy silence. As he returned to his seat, a few students like Sarah nodded at him in quiet solidarity, but no one dared to speak out against Ms. Carson. The teacher's cold eyes followed Daniel, as if waiting for him to break under her scrutiny. But instead of feeling discouraged, Daniel felt a fire of determination building within him. He knew this confrontation wasn't over, and he would not let himself be crushed by this injustice. After the tense presentation and Ms. Carson's public belittling, the atmosphere in the classroom became even more oppressive. Curious, fearful, and mocking glances followed Daniel every time he entered the room. But instead of feeling afraid or backing down, Daniel grew more determined not to let this injustice break him. He knew he couldn't let this continue unchecked. A few days after the presentation, Ms. Carson decided it was time to deal with the problem she thought Daniel was causing. In her mind, Daniel wasn't just a difficult student. He was someone who dared to challenge her authority in the classroom. She decided to arrange a parent-teacher conference, thinking that bringing his parents into the situation would help her correct his behavior. In her view, Daniel's parents must be just like him, disrespectful of authority and clueless about the seriousness of education. One morning, before class started, Ms. Carson walked into the room with an air of confidence, as if she was certain she would finally take control of the situation with Daniel. After taking attendance, she stood in front of the class and said with a false, sugary tone, "I have an important announcement for you all. Today after school, I'll be meeting with Daniel's parents to discuss his behavior and academic performance. This will be a good opportunity to improve the cooperation between school and family." Daniel heard her words, and frustration welled up inside him. He knew Ms. Carson was trying to bring his parents into the situation to undermine him further. However, what Ms. Carson didn't know was that he wasn't just any ordinary student, and his father, Thomas White, wasn't just any ordinary parent. He was the principal of Maplewood High School. After class, as usual, Daniel packed up his books and prepared to leave. Before he could walk out the door, Ms. Carson called out to him, her voice dripping with mockery. "Daniel, I hope you're not too anxious about the meeting with your parents after school. I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing about your attitude in class." Daniel just nodded, staying silent. He knew her words were just part of her power play, an attempt to control the situation. He turned and left the classroom, waiting for what would happen next. That afternoon, after all the students had left, Ms. Carson sat in her office, waiting confidently. She sat with a smug expression, thinking this meeting would be her chance to prove her authority, once and for all. Little did she know she was about to face an unexpected surprise. A knock came at the door. Ms. Carson stood up, lips pressed tightly together, and walked over to open it. Standing in front of her was a tall, well-dressed man in a sharp suit. This was Thomas White, Daniel's father. But he was also the principal of Maplewood High School. Yet Ms. Carson didn't recognize him right away. "Hello," Ms. Carson said, her professional tone barely hiding a hint of arrogance. "I assume you're Daniel's father?" Mr. White nodded, his eyes calm but authoritative. "Yes, I'm Thomas White, Daniel's father," he replied, but didn't mention his position as principal. "Good," Ms. Carson continued, smiling with satisfaction. "I'm eager to discuss your son's attitude and behavior in class. I believe there are some issues that need to be addressed. Daniel has repeatedly challenged my authority and disrupts class by bringing up inappropriate personal views. Moreover, he seems unable to grasp the true essence of the lessons we're teaching." Mr. White remained silent for a moment, his gaze becoming more focused. He clearly understood that this wasn't just a personal issue, but a display of underlying prejudice Ms. Carson had been harboring. He decided to let her continue, wanting to hear everything she thought about his son. Ms. Carson went on, "In fact, I think Daniel needs to be guided more by his family. He has an attitude of defiance and doesn't respect the authority of teachers. Students like him often struggle to adapt to a serious academic environment like ours. Mr. White raised an eyebrow slightly, but his voice remained calm. So you believe Daniel is struggling to keep up in your class because of his attitude? Exactly, Ms. Carson replied, her eyes glinting with smug satisfaction. He consistently questions the content I teach, especially regarding issues of race. I think he's confusing personal feelings with academic material. Mr. White slowly stood up, his face growing more serious. He looked Ms. Carson directly in the eyes and spoke with finality. Ms. Carson, I think it's time you knew the truth. I'm not only Daniel's father, I'm also the principal of this school. Ms. Carson froze. Mr. White's words hit her like a lightning bolt. Her mouth fell open and her eyes widened in shock. You're... she stammered, unable to believe what she was hearing. Yes, Mr. White confirmed. I'm Thomas White, the principal of Maplewood High School, and Daniel is my son. I've been listening closely to everything you've said about him, and I see very clearly the bias and prejudice you've been displaying. Ms. Carson stood paralyzed, unable to speak. The smugness drained from her face, replaced by fear and anxiety. She had no idea that she had been unjustly treating the son of the school's principal, and now all her actions were being laid bare before the person with the most power in the school. And we will have a much longer conversation about your behavior in class, Mr. White said, his voice calm but icy. But for now, I think you should return to your classroom and reflect on what's happened. I'll be observing your teaching methods tomorrow. Ms. Carson couldn't hold on to her confidence anymore. She could only nod mechanically, her face still pale with shock and fear. As she left the office, she was filled with dread over the consequences she would soon face. The following morning, news of the meeting between Ms. Carson and Thomas White, the man Ms. Carson now knew was the principal, spread quickly through Maplewood High School. While no one knew the exact details of the meeting, everyone sensed that something had changed. The atmosphere in the history class shifted, with students whispering to each other, wondering what would happen next with Ms. Carson, who had always seemed so confident and authoritative. When the bell rang to start the class, the students quietly entered the room. Ms. Carson stood at the front as usual, but the cold, imposing demeanor she was known for had softened. She tried to maintain a professional appearance, but her stiff posture and tense eyes betrayed the anxiety she felt. Students like Sarah, who sat in the front row, immediately noticed the difference. They exchanged curious glances, sensing that something big was about to happen. Once everyone was seated, the classroom door opened. Mr. Thomas White, the principal, stepped into the room with a commanding presence. His steady footsteps echoed on the floor, and the entire class fell silent instantly. The students held their breath, recognizing that the principal's presence meant something important was about to unfold. Mr. White scanned the room, his eyes briefly landing on Daniel, his son, before moving to Ms. Carson, who stood motionless, clearly nervous. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. White said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Today, I will be observing Ms. Carson's class. I expect you all to continue as normal." The class seemed to grow even quieter, the tension palpable. No one dared to speak. Ms. Carson nodded at Mr. White, trying to keep her composure, but her eyes were filled with anxiety. "Yes, Principal White," she replied in a low voice, her usual confidence gone. "We'll continue with today's lesson." She turned toward the board and began teaching, but all the students could feel that Mr. White's presence had completely changed the atmosphere of the lesson. Ms. Carson's words no longer carried the same weight they once did. She stammered through her history lesson, sometimes mixing up concepts. The students, who had grown accustomed to her cold, authoritative style, were now watching in disbelief as their teacher appeared uncertain and fearful. The tension reached its peak when Daniel, as he usually did, raised his hand to participate in a class discussion. This was the moment the entire class had been waiting for. In the past, whenever Daniel raised his hand, Ms. Carson would deliberately ignore him or respond with snide remarks. But today, with Mr. White sitting at the back of the room, the situation had completely changed. Ms. Carson, unable to ignore Daniel's raised hand, bit her lip and reluctantly called on him. "All right, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "What do you want to say about today's lesson?" Daniel stood up, his eyes steady and determined. He had been preparing for this moment, and he knew this was his chance to show his knowledge and insight without fear of being belittled. "I think we can't discuss the civil rights movement without acknowledging the deep impact of racial injustice on society. These injustices didn't just affect Black Americans at the time, they shaped the entire nation." All eyes were on Daniel. The students sat silently, waiting to see how Ms. Carson would react. In the past, she would have immediately cut him off and ridiculed his perspective. But today, under the watchful eyes of Mr. White, she couldn't do that. Her face was tense and her eyes darted around, searching for a reasonable response. "Yes, perhaps you have a point," Ms. Carson said, her voice strained as she tried to sound neutral. The class was stunned. This was the first time Ms. Carson had actually listened to and acknowledged a point from Daniel without immediately dismissing it. Daniel sat down, exchanging a brief glance with his father, who was sitting at the back of the room. Mr. White gave a slight nod to his son, a small gesture but one filled with meaning. It was a sign of recognition for Daniel's perseverance and courage. He had overcome the obstacles Ms. Carson had placed in his way and proved that he deserved to be heard. But the story didn't end there. After the class ended, Mr. White asked Ms. Carson to stay behind. He waited until all the students had left before approaching the teacher. The tension in the room was thick, and Ms. Carson knew she was about to face the consequences of her actions. "Ms. Carson," Mr. White began, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I observed your teaching today, and I noticed several areas that need improvement. In particular, I want to address the way you've been treating students in your class, especially Daniel." Ms. Carson lowered her head, unable to meet Mr. White's gaze. I'm sorry, Principal White. I didn't know Daniel was your son," she said, her voice filled with regret. Mr. White shook his head. "Ms. Carson, the issue isn't whether or not you knew Daniel was my son. The issue is the way you've treated a student simply because he dared to express his own thoughts and because he's different. You've shown clear bias and prejudice in your classroom, and that is unacceptable for any educator." Mr. White's words rang out like a judgment, and Ms. Carson became even more nervous and fearful. She couldn't defend her actions, knowing full well that she was in the wrong. "We will be discussing the necessary steps to address this situation," Mr. White continued. "But I want you to understand one thing. In this school, there is no place for discrimination, whether it's subtle or blatant. Every student has the right to be respected, heard, and treated fairly, regardless of their race, background, or beliefs." Ms. Carson remained silent, unable to say anything in her defense. She knew that her career was now hanging by a thread, and the consequences of her actions would not be easily brushed aside. After the tense conversation with Principal Thomas White, Ms. Carson left the classroom feeling heavy-hearted. The confidence and authority she had always projected in front of her students had completely vanished, replaced by anxiety and fear. She knew that Mr. White wouldn't let her actions slide and that the consequences wouldn't end with a simple reprimand. She began to realize that she had gone too far, and this could have a significant impact on her career. When Ms. Carson returned to class the next day, the atmosphere had completely changed. The students, who had once been cautious and even fearful of her, now looked at her differently. Some, like Sarah, who sat in the front row, exchanged knowing glances with Daniel and a few other students. There was a shared understanding between them. They had realized what had been happening all along, the injustice that Daniel had been enduring. Ms. Carson stood at the front of the class, trying to regain her confidence, but the nervousness was clear in her shaky movements. She began her lesson, but her voice lacked the strength and control it once had. The students sat quietly, not out of fear, but because they could feel the shift in power. Ms. Carson's authority was slowly slipping away. The tension in the room became even more apparent when Daniel, with calm but resolute eyes, once again raised his hand to participate. For Daniel, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He no longer feared Ms. Carson. His father, Mr. White, had shown him that no one had the right to silence him because of his differences. This time, Miss Carson couldn't ignore him. She had no choice but to call on Danielle, but her voice was filled with apprehension. "All right, Daniel, what would you like to contribute to today's lesson?" she asked, her voice shaky, as if dreading what was about to happen. Daniel stood up confidently, his voice strong. "I'd like to continue our discussion on the injustices of the civil rights movement that we talked about yesterday," he began. "I believe we can't overlook the far-reaching impact of racial inequality on society. This is an essential part of understanding history and its effects on the present." Once again, the class fell silent. The tension was thick as all eyes turned toward Ms. Carson. In the past, she would have immediately mocked or cut off Daniel's comments, but now, she couldn't do that. She was forced to sit and listen, her eyes wide with discomfort. The sharp words she once wielded like a weapon were now useless. After Daniel finished speaking, Mr. Thomas White, who had been observing from the back of the room, stood up and walked to the front. He looked around the class, then turned to Ms. Carson, his gaze stern. "Students," Mr. White began, his voice calm but commanding, "I want you all to understand that school is not just a place to learn facts and knowledge. It's also a place where we learn how to treat each other with respect and fairness. What has been happening in this classroom goes against the values our school stands for." He paused for a moment, making sure his message was clear before continuing. Then he turned to Ms. Carson, his voice growing more serious. "Ms. Carson, based on what I've observed and from what I've heard from the students, it's clear that your behavior in this class has been unacceptable for an educator. You've used your position to impose your personal biases and authority over your students, particularly Daniel. This cannot be tolerated in any classroom." The room was so silent that you could hear a pin drop. All eyes were on Ms. Carson, who had gone pale, struggling to maintain her composure. She opened her mouth as if to say something in her defense, but no words came out. She knew there was no way out. Everything was now laid bare. "I will not allow any student in this school to be subjected to discrimination, whether subtle or overt," Mr. White continued, his voice growing stronger. "We teach our students that everyone has value regardless of their race, background, or beliefs, and as teachers, we must set the example for showing respect and fairness." Ms. Carson lowered her head, unable to look up. She knew that her career was at a dead end. What she had done to Daniel wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation of the basic principles of fairness and respect that the school represented. Mr. White turned back to the students, his tone softening as he addressed them once more. "I hope you've learned an important lesson from this situation. Always stand up for what's right, respect one another, and never be afraid to speak out against injustice." After his speech, Mr. White turned to Ms. Carson with finality. "I expect you to gather your things and leave the classroom immediately. We'll be discussing this further with the school board, but I believe the decision has already been made clear." Ms. Carson stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what she had just heard. She knew it was over. There was no more authority, no more control, only defeat and regret. She silently gathered her teaching materials and quickly left the classroom, the students watching her departure in stunned silence. As Ms. Carson left, the atmosphere in the classroom lightened noticeably. The students exchanged glances, almost in disbelief at what had just happened. Sarah turned to Daniel and smiled softly. She knew that Daniel had won this battle, not just for himself, but for all the students in the class. A few others began to smile as well, and the tension in the room dissipated. Daniel sat down, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, after days of tension and oppression, he had overcome the toughest challenge. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He had made a real change in how people thought about fairness and respect. After Ms. Carson left the classroom, the atmosphere in the room changed drastically. The tension and injustice that had once hung over the class were gone, replaced by a sense of relief and freedom that the students hadn't experienced before. The students began talking to each other about what had just happened, exchanging glances filled with understanding and realization that they had just witnessed something significant. Not just a shift in teaching, but a shift in attitudes toward fairness and respect. Daniel sat quietly in the corner of the room, feeling the change in the air. He didn't feel triumphant over Ms. Carson's departure. What he felt was a deep sense of accomplishment. After days of being oppressed and treated unfairly, he had finally been recognized. The other students also began to realize what Daniel had gone through, and they felt a growing sense of empathy and even admiration for him. After class ended, as Daniel was getting ready to leave, Sarah, who had always sat in the front quietly observing, approached him. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of what to say, but finally, she sighed and spoke softly. "Daniel, I just wanted to apologize for not speaking up earlier. I knew what Ms. Carson was doing was wrong, but I was scared. I didn't know how to help you." Daniel looked up, smiling gently. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with understanding. "I get it. Standing up against injustice isn't easy, but just the fact that you understand and are willing to change means a lot." Sarah nodded, feeling relieved after saying what had been on her mind. "I hope from now on we can do something to change the school. Maybe we need a space where everyone can share their views, a place where everyone's voice can be heard." Daniel agreed with her suggestion. He had thought about creating an environment where all students, regardless of race or background, could feel like they had a voice. "I agree, we should start a club or discussion group where students can share their opinions and experiences," he said. "We need to create change within the school, so no one feels overlooked or treated unfairly anymore." Daniel's words sparked a new sense of purpose among the students around him. Ideas about promoting diversity and inclusion began to flow. Not just Sarah, but several other students approached Daniel and started sharing their thoughts. A small group of students began to form, all with the same goal: to make the school a place where everyone was respected and had a voice. The next day, when Daniel arrived at school, he noticed a clear change. The students who had once stood on the sidelines now began to approach him and greet him. They no longer looked at him with curious or distant eyes, but instead with respect and recognition. A few students had already begun discussing forming a club for inclusion, where everyone could talk about issues related to discrimination and unfair treatment. At lunchtime, Daniel was invited to sit with a group of students he hadn't interacted with before. They began asking him about his feelings after what had happened with Ms. Carson and shared their thoughts on the changes that were needed at the school. "I think we should have a seminar on diversity," a student named James suggested. "Maybe invite outside speakers to talk about how to confront discrimination in society." "That's a great idea," Daniel replied. "I think opening up conversations like that will help us all understand each other better, not just about race, but about how we can support each other in every aspect of life." The discussion continued, and more students joined in, bringing their ideas and suggestions. From diversifying the curriculum to include more works from different cultures, to creating mentoring programs for minority students, the plans began to take shape. Everyone agreed that change was necessary, and they all committed to working together to make the school a more inclusive and respectful place. As the final bell rang at the end of the day, Daniel left the classroom with a new sense of hope. He knew that his fight wasn't just about facing Ms. Carson. It was the beginning of a much longer journey to change the way the entire student community thought. And the most important thing was that he no longer had to fight alone. He now had new friends and allies who shared his ideals and determination. On his way out of the school, Daniel met up with his father, Thomas White, who was waiting for him by the school gate. They walked together in silence, but both understood what was going on in each other's minds. Mr. White looked at Daniel with pride. "You know, Daniel, you've done something that not many people have the courage to do," he said. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You've opened the door for so many other students. I'm proud of you." Daniel nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thanks, Dad," he replied. but I just hope that the changes I'm helping to make will last. There are so many people out there who still face injustice every day, and we can't let that continue." Mr. White agreed, patting Daniel gently on the shoulder. "You're right. Change never comes easily, but you've shown everyone that it's possible as long as we don't give up." As Daniel looked back at the school one more time, he felt proud of what he had accomplished and determined to continue on the path he had started. He knew the journey would be long, but with the support of his community, friends, and family, he no longer had to walk it alone. The events at Maplewood High School had shown that discrimination and injustice can exist anywhere, even in modern academic settings. But more importantly, they had shown that with courage, persistence, and determination, people like Daniel can create real change. Schools are not just places for learning knowledge, but also for learning how to live, how to respect each other, and how to build a more just community. The end of the story isn't just a personal victory, but the beginning of a larger journey. A journey that everyone, from students to teachers, commits to walking together to create a place where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, has the opportunity to thrive and succeed. Thank you for following along with this story. If you want to continue supporting meaningful messages like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new video. We look forward to seeing you again.